thank you all for the invitation to be back with you. Recall last week we were bragging about what great weather you always roll out for us, so thanks. We had a little of everything driving up here: clouds, rain, wind, but still a beautiful day in Sandpoint, so it's nice to be here with you. If you were here last week, you recall we were considering the crucifixion of Christ as reported to us by Mark. Mark, in very swift terms, gives us the description of this moment in which Jesus, having gone through the gauntlet of 3 hours, darkness across the face of the land, Jesus in the place of the curse. The Apostles' Creed famously says he descended into hell. It might be more accurate to say hell descended onto him as he was there. And then coming out the other end, of course, the remarkable, astonishing moment when Mark says he let out a great cry. It was a victory cry. It was the roar of a lion. And it sent a seismic shock down the Via Dolorosa right into the heart of Jerusalem and tore a curtain in two. And of course, at that moment, the way was opened. The way was open to the hilasmos, the mercy seat. But the surprise is the mercy seat was not in that temple. It was just an empty room that was exposed. The mercy seat was outside of Jerusalem at a place called Golgotha. We hear in the New Testament, he became our hilasmos. Paul tells us that. John tells us that, 1 John chapter 2, verse 3. The New Testament tells us there is the true temple, you see. Well, that was the first effect, and I mentioned to you last week that we were going to look at the second effect of that victory shout of Christ. And that's given to us in verse 39 actually, of chapter 15 of Mark's Gospel. So our text this morning is one verse. Should be a short sermon, wouldn't you think? We'll see how it goes. Chapter 15, verse 39, Gospel of Mark, Word of God. And when the centurion who stood there in front of Jesus heard his cry and saw how he died, he said, surely this man was the Son of God. The Word of God. Thanks be to God for this word. Would you please pray with me? Our Father, we are grateful that in that unspeakable moment that changed all of history, the roar of the Lion of the tribe of Judah, announcing victory over hell, over sin, over the curse, over everything that tied us up and made us hopeless and helpless. All of that set aside in that great moment. Our prayer this morning is that we might, in some new and fresh way, appreciate what that centurion said. This man was the Son of God. And for that, we give you thanks now in the name of Christ. Amen. Well, the centurion, Gentile, Roman, a routine execution on a Friday morning, and somehow or other, everything changed. I want to deal with a little technical point right off the bat. Now, I'm doing this right up front because I hate it when people's eyes glaze over too early, and so I just want to get this out of the way. But some of the Bibles, including the one I have, by the way, don't you like my Bible? It's, I was in the First World War with it, actually. It was, my wife is giving me a bad time about that. I love this Bible. I've just carried it with me for years, so here it is. But my Bible here, the NIV, and maybe yours as well, has a little footnote connected with the comment made by the centurion. The main text will read, this man was the Son of God, but sometimes you'll find down as an alternate translation, this man was a son of God. Any of you have that? Do you see that there? All right. So I want to deal with that because that has been sometimes taken as an indication the centurion really didn't get it. That he was reflecting that common Greco-Roman understanding that there were people out there that were sort of special philosophers, rulers, miracle workers, people who had some special giftedness. And they were, in fact, called in the ancient world sometimes sons of God. And that what this centurion was doing was simply sort of seeing a parallel between the remarkable details of Jesus' death here and these others who were similarly celebrated, and that's all that's going on. Now, if you want the technical justification for what I'm going to say, then please, let's have a little talk after the service. I'll give it. It has to do with the predicate nominative and the placement of the verb and stuff like that.
Not a Greek lesson, no.
This man needs remedial training, But anyway, I just want to say to you point blank that is not a legitimate alternative. There have been books written on this. The irony is that the peculiar construction that Mark gives to that phrase can only be translated, this man was the Son of God, it actually has a little extra emphasis. This man was exclusively the one and only, the unique Son of God. That's the sense of the text. And as I say, we can talk about why that's the case. I just want you to take my word for it right now. Would you do that? So work with me on this. So if you're a skeptic, we can have that conversation. But for our purposes right now, we're just going to take that as what he said, because it is in fact what he said. And that's what Mark wants us to hear. This man was the Son of God. But then there have been those who've said, well, how could the centurion have known that? Here he is, he's a Gentile, he's a Roman, he's an outsider, for Pete's sake, how can this guy have any clue about the notion of being a son of God in any sense that would be compatible with an Old Testament understanding of that expression? But again, we don't want to bring too much baggage to the text. Who knows what the man was aware of? He may have been in Israel for a long time. He may have been quite familiar. Nobody could live in Israel without having picked up some idea of how these Jewish people perceive things. It was pretty conspicuous in their culture. And so we don't want to just, in a kind of gratuitous way, assume things about what he may or may not have known. The fact of the matter is, at least as Mark tells the story, he wants us to get the idea that this man had a perfectly clear understanding of what he was saying, and that what he's saying is not simply a kind of response of shock, it's a response of faith. Because Mark has been leading us through the whole gospel to this moment, and he wants us to stand there with that centurion and unite with him in saying, this man was the Son of God, and see the implications thereof, not only with respect to the moment in history, but with respect to the rest of my life and what I'm going to do about it. And so Mark has carefully constructed a narrative that brings us to this dramatic moment. It is interesting, by the way, that the term being a son of God, or that notion being a son of God, is found in the Old Testament, not frequently, but certainly it's there. We shouldn't be surprised to hear that the first time in the Old Testament that anybody is ever described in any sense whatsoever as being a son of God is connected with the Passover. The original, that little sound you heard, that means, take special note, that was an important point. So, just saying. That Passover was the first time somebody was ever called the Son of God. Now, it shouldn't surprise us because, as we were saying last week, we are supposed to be thinking about the Passover in connection with the crucifixion of Christ because, after all, it took place on Passover. They had just had the Passover meal the night before. Jesus had it with his disciples. The Paschal Lamb is offered on that day. You see, this is the biggest event in Jewish reckoning of their religious calendar. And here is Jesus on the Passover, the true Paschal Lamb. And so the parallels should be screaming at us. And in fact, we noticed last week already the darkness coming in, covering the face of the land, reminding us of that final plague before the death of the firstborn. When Moses was out there on the backside of the wilderness, herding sheep, where he'd been for some 40 years, you know the story from Exodus, he ran into a burning bush. He had a conversation with that bush, and the course of history changed. Because God, speaking to him through that means, commanded him to go to Egypt and say to Pharaoh, "Let my people go." You know the story. Moses had a little bit of, pushback, but eventually caved in. In chapter 4 of Exodus, verse 21 and following, God says to Moses, "You go and tell Pharaoh this: Israel is my son." First time. And then God says, in addition to that, "Go tell Pharaoh, let my son go, or your son, Mr. Pharaoh, will be forfeit." And so Moses goes, and in the context of the Passover, the whole thing starts when Moses says to Pharaoh, "Israel is my son." Israel, in some sense or other, in the Old Testament is regarded occasionally as it were, a son of God. But what we need to appreciate about that is the only reason they could ever make that claim was based on the fact that during the Passover, they took the blood of the Paschal Lamb and they went out, and on the front door of their house, they plastered blood on the doorpost and on the lintel, and as it were, standing at the foot of the cross, recognized that a Paschal Lamb was the only thing that was going to exempt them from the loss of their own firstborn. The only reason they could regard themselves in any sense at all as sons of God is because of the death of a lamb. And my friends, the only way and the only reason any of us can ever presume to use an expression of ourselves that we are children of God, sons of God, daughters of God, is because we had stood at the foot of the cross, just as they did, and recognized that there is only one true Son of God, and we are only accepted insofar as we are in him. We have no independent claim whatsoever to pray as Jesus taught us, "Our Father who art in heaven," unless Jesus is our elder brother and has included us in that family connection. And so even that expression from the Centurion, "This man was the Son of God," takes us back dramatically to the Passover moment in which that particular idea was first rolled out for their consideration. This idea of being the Son of God, however, in Mark's gospel is fundamental to the whole case he's making. This Gospel of Mark is a literary masterpiece. That's been noted many times. It's the shortest of the gospel, the most tightly organized. The word choices are the most precise. The man was, humanly speaking, a literary genius. And it's been noted that from a literary point of view, the climactic moment of the gospel, the point that he's been heading toward like a locomotive all the way through the gospel, was to bring us to this precise point where the centurion says, "This man was the Son of God." Other titles for Jesus are certainly found in Mark's gospel. He's called the Messiah by Peter at Caesarea Philippi. He's called the Son of Man. Often Jesus uses that term for himself. He's called the Lord. Other terms are used, but this is the one which seems to string the whole book together in a series of rather remarkable and dramatic moments. 8 times in Mark's gospel, Jesus is called Son of God, the Son of God, 8 times. 2 of them are the announcement of heaven. 2 of them are the announcement of hell. 2 of them are from the lips of Christ himself. And then Mark brings us to the final moment in which the last 2 are his intractable enemies. One, his prosecutor, one, his executioner. Both of them confess the man is the Son of God. The first one twists that into a concocted accusation of criminal behavior and orchestrates the execution so that the second of them, the executioner, could stand there and in an epiphany of faith realize this man is the Son of God. And his life was turned around forever. And Mark wants us to ask ourselves the question as we reach the end of his gospel, which one are we? Prosecutor who nails him to the cross, or executioner who repents? Well, we've all been the prosecutor. We were all there nailing him to the cross. That was a collective effort of the human race, and we all participated. But some of us have joined the Centurion to see something else. The first of those that I mentioned, the announcement of heaven, it began when Jesus was baptized. This is the very beginning of Mark's gospel. Mark doesn't tell us about the birth of Christ, doesn't tell us about the Virgin Mary, doesn't tell us any of the shepherds or all of that. You know, you've read it. You know that starts right off with John the Baptist, and Jesus comes and is baptized. And after Jesus is baptized, we hear that the heavens were ripped apart. That's the term he uses. Schizade is the word. Like a schismatic or a schizophrenic. Being rent apart, torn apart, that's the word. It's the most dramatic expression of that in the New Testament. The others say the heavens parted, something more polite, not for Mark. There's a kind of violence to it. The heavens were torn apart, and a voice comes out of the heavens. This is my beloved Son. This is my Son. It's the first announcement, comes straight from heaven. The next time the term schizane is used, it's only used twice, is at the end of Mark's gospel. The 2 words stand, as it were, as bookends to represent one great truth, beginning with the baptism and ending with this moment of the atoning work of Christ, and especially now at the crucifixion. The heavens are torn apart at the beginning. What do you suppose is torn apart at the end? The curtains, same word. That's no accident. The curtains were torn apart. The curtains, by the way, in the ancient Jewish temple had all kinds of celestial engravings. The moon, the sun, the stars, constellations, all of that was part of the decoration. So in some ways, the heavens were torn apart twice. Once in the baptism, once in the crucifixion of Christ, and in both cases, of course, the point was this. That great barricade that has prevented us from entering into the precincts of God's presence has now been taken away. The baptism of Christ at the beginning and his atoning work at the end has opened for us access into heaven itself, has created a connection between heaven and earth. You recall that Jacob, as he was heading toward Padam Aram, fleeing from his brother Esau, spent the night in a place that came to be called Bethel. He had kind of a rough night, and he dreamed of a ladder. Remember that? Connecting heaven and earth. First time Jesus saw Nathanael, John chapter 1. Jesus said to him, I tell you, you are going to see angels ascending and descending on the Son of Man. Because that's what Nathanael had been thinking about as he was under that fig tree. And Jesus tells him, you are looking at the one who connects heaven and earth, the one in whom the heaven will be access as the curtain that separates them is split. The other time that heaven tells us that Jesus is God's Son is the Transfiguration. Jesus takes Peter, James, and John up on the mountain, and the glory within him spills out for a moment. It was always there. It was always present. It's why his words carried such weight, why his person was so powerful. There was glory inside him, but it was kept concealed for the most part. But occasionally we beheld his glory, the glory of the only begotten of the Father, full of grace and truth. Occasionally it spilled out. And this was the most important moment, and those three disciples there saw that. And then they saw two others flanking Jesus. The two prophets, the two witnesses, the law and the prophets, Moses and Elijah. They want to build a, tabernacle for all three of them. But a voice comes from heaven and says, this is my beloved Son, hear him. All roads lead to this one. The law leads to Christ. The prophets lead to Christ. He is the final defining truth. And so the access we have into heaven is going to teach us the fundamental truth of all reality, that Christ is that by which all things hang together. He is the truth. And so heaven tells us that it's the Son of God who gives us access to the presence of God, to the grace that God has offered us. It comes through Christ and not by anybody else, period. But hell also announces that Jesus is the Son of God. Chapter 3 of Mark, verse 11. Mark tells us Jesus is healing all manner of diseases. They're bringing people with every kind of malady you can imagine, and Jesus heals them all. Nothing's too tough. But the one point that Mark highlights is that Jesus cast out many demons. And he says there, verse 11, chapter 3, as these demons were exorcised by Christ, they would say, you are the Son of God. Again and again, seeing as if they were wearing Frodo's ring, the realities that were hidden somewhat from others. This great spiritual truth, this is the Son of God. There's no resisting his authority, and out they go. The most dramatic example came 2 chapters later, however, in Mark's gospel, in which Jesus takes a little excursion away from the precincts of Israel over to Gentile land, a place called Gadara. It's on the east side, in the region called Decapolis. Gentiles live there, east side of the Sea of Galilee. So Jesus takes his disciples off on their first little excursion into international territory, arrives, walks up on the beach, and he's confronted by a character commonly called the Gadarene demoniac. This whack job. Screaming, crying, a terrorist, frightening. You could hear his shrieks at a great distance. You can imagine parents putting their kids to bed at night. Good night, sweetheart. Have a nice, sweet dreams. And all of a sudden, through the window, you hear this awful, ghastly sound of some guy out in the cemetery screaming. And they'd try to control him. They'd put him in chains. They'd put him in shackles. They'd put him in ropes. They'd tie him up. They'd try to just break them like so much thread. They couldn't restrain the man. He was out of control. He was a strong man. That was the principal description Mark gives us of this man. He was incapable of being controlled. Rather reminds us of a character in the Old Testament who is described similarly. Samson was, in a sense, God's strong man. This one represented in some ways the devil's strong man. Couldn't be controlled. A kind of diabolical, hellish Samson. Seized with all of the powers of hell itself so that nobody could restrain him. But one day, that diabolical Samson saw someone walking to him on the beach of Gadara. And he saw in a way that others probably wouldn't recognize who this was. And he protests. Literally, it reads, what do you have to do with me? That's what it says. What do you have to do with me? That's an idiom in that language for something like this. What are you doing here? You ever been asked that question? What are you doing here? It usually isn't a friendly question, you know. What are you doing here? Because you see, this demon thought, I'm in Gentile world. You know, Israel's the place where God has his beachhead, his presence in this world. The rest of the world belongs to us. That's what the devil said to Jesus at the temptation. This world is given to me, it's mine, I give it to whom I want. What are you doing here? This demon asked the same question. What are you doing here? Jesus, Son of the Most High God? It's his question. But of course, this demon, as strong as he was no contest. It carries out one of the themes, a kind of what's sometimes called a motif in Mark's gospel, called the strong man motif. It comes up many times in various ways. The most famous, clear example is when Jesus says somewhat later, no one can plunder the goods of a strong man unless he first binds the strong man. Then you can plunder his goods. Jesus had come to plunder the goods of a usurper who had taken over control of this world and who's represented in some way by this Gadarene demoniac who is the quintessential strong man of hell who cannot be controlled, confronting the stronger man of heaven. And in spite of his protests, he is cast out. And this man is recovered. The goods of the strong man are plundered as this poor character is restored to sanity. I don't know about you. I've got a couple of demons. You ever found yourself wrestling with something and just feel like you can't get a handle on it? And you find yourself at some moment saying something and you think later, what an idiot, why did I say that? Or sometimes you do something and then later you just realize, what's the matter with me? You don't know what got into you. Have you ever said that? I don't know what got into me. Nothing got into you. There's a strong man living in you right now. Paul calls it the flesh, goes by other terms. And sometimes we fall into this ridiculous delusion that we can fight the strong man. And we try to bind him up. We try to put him in chains. We try to, domesticate him. We try to make him behave himself. You ever had that feeling? There's this beast inside, and it may take different forms with different people. Sometimes it's an outburst of anger. Sometimes it's profanity. Sometimes it's lust. Sometimes it's immorality. Sometimes it's worry. Sometimes it's, you name it. For different people, it's a different kind of strong man, but it takes over. And you can't get a hold of it. And you've tried everything those townspeople tried, trying to get that strong man to behave. At least in church. There's only one in the universe who is competent to bind that strong man. And you'll never win the battle without his presence. And so we learn that Jesus opens the way to heaven, but we also learn that Jesus liberates us from hell. The same Son of God frees us from the one so we can enter the other. Only the Son of God can do that. Jesus actually refers to himself a couple of times as the Son of God. On one occasion, this is during Holy Week, Tuesday of that week, Jesus has just been welcomed. We just sang a great song that celebrates this. Jesus comes into Jerusalem. Blessed is the one who comes in the name of the Lord. They're excited. Then Jesus, who's coming as the king, exercises his kingly prerogative. He goes to the temple from which the Messiah was supposed to rule, to check it out. What's its condition? He's not happy with what he sees. Has to do a little house cleaning. Chases out those who are creating a sabotage of what was supposed to be a house of prayer. Comes back on Tuesday, and as the king judge announces his verdict. Sometimes we think in Holy Week Jesus was on trial. No. Jerusalem was on trial. The religious leaders were on trial. Those who were responsible and had a fiduciary obligation to lead the people of God in worship were on trial. And the judge has now assessed their performance and found it wanting. And his verdict, therefore, is a verdict of guilty. Guilty is charged. The kingdom is taken from you and given to others worthy of it. This temple in which you take such pride is left to you desolate. Not one stone is going to be left on another. It's going to be set aside permanently, irrevocably. The true temple is here. And Jesus delivers that verdict in the context of a parable. Not a parable difficult to interpret or understand, one that was perfectly obvious. It's a story of a vineyard and tenant farmers charged with the duty of caring for the vineyard, and they in their greed decide to seize it for themselves, and thus when the owner sends his servants to collect a dividend, they abuse them, they kick them out, they harm them, they kill them. And then the owner says, well, I guess I'll have to send my son. Surely they'll respect him. And in the context of the parable, there's no doubt Jesus refers to himself and predicts with perfect accuracy what these people would do, namely, kill him and seize the vineyard as if they could own it, taking it from the true owner. And Jesus, of course, presents himself to them as that true son. He comes thus with the authority of the owner. He comes with nothing less than the authority of God himself, because, my friends, he is God himself. To say Jesus is the Son of God is to say, as we read elsewhere in the New Testament, that he is equal to God, and that's exactly how Mark wants us to hear it. At the same time, in the Olivet Discourse, Jesus says, no one knows the hour, not the angels in heaven, not the Son. Because the one who came to us as God also came to us as humanity. He came as man. Chalcedon said, truly God, truly man, two natures, one person, two distinct natures, deity, humanity, combined together. This is the one we worship. He comes with all of the great power of God, and yet he limited himself for a time to human size and shape, limited his omnipotence so that he got tired, he got hungry, limited his omnipresence, so if he was going to go somewhere, he had to walk like the rest of us, even limited his omniscience so that there were things he didn't know. He came to us as man, at the same time God, and when Jesus presents himself as the Son, he wants us to have a picture of who he actually is. And so in the whole Gospel of Mark, he's knit together this, as it were, collage of perspectives on the one who is the Son of God. And then he brings us to the finish line and says, so what are you going to do about it? There were two who gave the last two confessions. One was the high priest, his prosecutor. His name was Joseph Caiaphas. Brilliant man. Excavations at the place which has been determined to be his home have disclosed that in the lower parts of his home, there was a kind of private trial chamber You know the term star chamber. That's kind of what was going on. It wasn't public. It wasn't something people were supposed to see. It represented some of the most colossal breaches of Jewish due process you can imagine, when prisoners were taken into that place and sometimes questioned under torture. In fact, there's little pillars there where people would be lashed and beaten as they were asked questions. That's what happened to Jesus. It wasn't the much worse scourging the Romans inflicted on him later, but it was a questioning Jesus in that place. Witnesses were brought in, paraded before him, making all kinds of accusations against him. Mark tells us Jesus remained silent. Isaiah said he would be brought silent as a lamb to the slaughter. The accusers came in, the witnesses tried to concoct all sorts of fabrications about laws that Jesus had allegedly broken. None of it got out of Jesus any response whatsoever. Finally, in frustration, Joseph Caiaphas, who was, among other things, a brilliant lawyer, asked a question. At least that's the way it's always translated, with a question mark at the end. Are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed One? That was the way the Jewish people would avoid using the word God. So it's the same thing as saying the Son of God, but that little substitute there. So Caiaphas says, are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed One? But in Greek, it's not a question. It's just a flat statement. It would be something more like this. So you're the Christ, the Son of the Blessed One. You see. In the law, that's called a leading question. When I was practicing law a few years ago, I went over to Seattle for a one-day seminar, 8 hours, and the entire 8 hours was devoted to the one issue: how to ask a leading question. Believe that? How to do cross-examination. 8 hours we spent together learning the fine art of leading questions. Because a leading question, when used resourcefully and effectively, will take a hostile, reluctant witness from wherever that witness is and drag them to where they don't want to go. That's the power of a leading question. And good lawyers can do it with great effect. I was never one of them. But it's another story. But it was very entertaining, and it was a wonderful day, and it made me think about this text. That's what Joseph Caiaphas is doing here. He's asking a perfect leading question. He wants Jesus to take the bait, to step in it, to get himself in trouble. He can't quite pull it together from these other false witnesses, so he just puts the question there to Jesus. So, you're the Christ, the Son of God. And for the first time, Jesus breaks his silence with words that must have knocked Joseph Caiaphas over, as Jesus now for the first time says in Greek, ego eimi. It was the Aramaic equivalent, but Mark wants us to hear it because it's so powerful. Ego eimi, I am. It's the standard name for God, Yahweh, in the Greek Old Testament. That's exactly the way it has to be heard. So you're the Christ, the Son of the living God. Ego eimi, I am Yahweh. You know what Joseph Caiaphas should have done at that point was torn his garments in repentance. He should have fallen on his face before one who was irrefutably, demonstrably God among them. Jesus had been performing miracles like mad. Nobody disputed that. Everybody knew that that kind of miracle power could only take place if God was with him, that God was endorsing this one, that God was attesting to its truthfulness. Nicodemus knew that much. We know. You're a teacher sent from God. No one can do this stuff unless God's with them. It was well known, and now Jesus says, as an attested messenger from God, I am God among you. That should have been sufficient to carry the freight right there. Well, Joseph Caiaphas did rend his garments, but the word that came out of his mouth was not a word of worship. It was a word of blasphemy. This man is blasphemed. And those who were with him concurred. and he was delivered to be crucified. We've all been there. Maybe you've been a Christian for all your life. Maybe you became a Christian somewhat recently. But all of us came into this world as Joseph Caiaphas. We all came in hostile to this one, with hearts hardened against him, and it was only grace that changed that heart. Just as it changed the heart of a centurion, who was equally indifferent, equally uncaring, equally determined to carry out another routine crucifixion of another routine criminal. And here he comes. We don't know exactly what loosened the mortar of this centurion. Maybe it was when they were hoisting Jesus up and Jesus said, "Father, forgive them. They haven't got a clue what they're doing." Maybe it was when Jesus was carrying out, in a sense, humanly, his last will and testament. "John, behold your mother. Mary, behold your son." And he assigns the care of Mary into the home of John. Maybe it was when Jesus promised to a thief on the cross, "Today you're going to be with me in paradise." Maybe it was when Jesus declined that sour wine, which was supposed to be a painkiller, because nothing would be permitted to deaden the pain of what Jesus must endure for 3 hours, from noon to 3, when darkness covered the face of the land, when the curse fell upon him and the wrath of God was poured out on him. Nothing could deaden that pain. But I suspect the thing that really put the icing on the cake for the centurion, when it was all over, he looked at Jesus, who should have been at the point of death, who should have been so weak and exhausted that you couldn't imagine how he would cling for another moment to life. And that man cried out with the roar of a lion, a victory shout that shook the whole region. And when the centurion saw how he shouted out, and then how he voluntarily died, recognizing Jesus didn't die of crucifixion. Jesus was nobody's victim. He had just won the greatest contest in the history of the human race, took a victory lap, shouted his triumph, and surrendered his spirit into the hands of his Father, with whom full fellowship had now been restored. And a centurion, beholding all of that, said, "This man was the Son of God." There's a pretty well-documented tradition in the church that the centurion's name was Longeus. He was, of course, in a position of some significant authority, a centurion. He had a pretty cozy job with the Roman military, a good retirement in front of him. The tradition of the church is he left that all behind. That shortly after this moment, he resigned his commission. He left behind the status that he had, the authority that he had, the prestige that he enjoyed. He left it all behind. He became one of that relatively small number at the beginning of Christian believers. And before too long, he began traveling around the ancient world on his own, telling people the story of how he stood at the cross. He stood where that paschal lamb was emblemized by a cross. He saw there the true Helos Mos. He saw the true mercy seat. He saw the place, the only place where sins could be forgiven. He saw it with the eyes of faith so clearly that his life was changed from that point on. And eventually he paid for that faith, that testimony, with his own life, preaching in Cappadocia, which is part of what we call modern-day Turkey. Some years later, having preached that message to great effect and to the saving of many souls over those few years. Because you see, standing at the foot of the cross and recognizing Jesus as the Son of God is not just kind of a one thing and then it's over and you go on with it. No, it changes you permanently. It changes you forever. It means that whatever Jesus commands you to do, you'll do it. Whatever he commands you to leave behind, you'll leave it. Whatever the terms are by which the Son of God has given direction to you, you're going to have the single-minded passion to do it with all your heart, up to and including martyrdom itself. Because Jesus said, if you want to be my disciple, then grab your cross and follow me. And that's what happens when you stand in faith, my friends, at the foot of the cross. You are changed permanently, irrevocably. And the redemption of Christ and the glory you'll share with him for eternity makes that all colossally worth it. So, have you stood at the foot of the cross lately? Have you seen that one who's there shouting in victory? Have you declared with that centurion and with millions of Christian people down through history, this man was and is the Son of God? Amen. Let's just pray. Father, what a moment. Unimaginable to us that this one left glory to join us in a broken human existence, was made like us in every respect, sin only accepted. And yet this one who never committed a sin became sin, became a curse, bore the just penalty thereof, shouted his victory, and has invited us in. Our prayer is that every person in this room has met Christ at the foot of the cross. And our prayer is also that every one of us in this room meets Christ at the foot of the cross every day of our lives to carry on the mission of what you've called us to do with grateful hearts and joyful spirits as we announce to every person we meet, this man is the Son of God.